Morning, anyone who's on my side of the planet, and good evening to everyone on the other side. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's one of the pleasures of having made this film, which was made in 2017 and premiered at the Sydney Film Festival, is that it's still engaging with audiences and people are still reaching out, contacting me about this film. I'm currently working at the University of New South Wales. I am a producer working in theatre, actually. So film has always been something that I've done, but it's never been the central sort of work pathway. But I've always worked in the creative arts, and I love multidisciplinary kind of arts anyway, and I find film is one of those things. In fact, today I can see that the editor of the film has joined us, Martin Fox. Hi, Martin. We don't see each other in Australia. We're all looking at each other online, similarly to you are, I'm sure, in Chicago. But yeah, I'm happy to have this conversation, and if people have questions, because a lot has happened since the film's come out. I've been to Trinidad. I, in fact, was contacted very recently by some other descendants of Trinidadian Jewish refugees. So yeah, this story is touching people, and I think has played a really important role in documenting that little part of that Jewish diaspora that came from the Second World War and the horrors of the Holocaust. So hi, everyone.
So you had this story. You went to look for your birth certificate. I think you were around the age of 14 and digging around in papers and realized, yeah, something's not right here.
Yeah,
So,
I was looking actually for my birth certificate and came across my parents' marriage certificate. And then I realized that I was looking at the details, thinking it was quite kind of this quaint, weird old document, and how next to my mother's name was the word spinster, which even in 1972 or 73 was like, whoa, that's so old fashioned. And then next to my father's name was divorced, and I didn't know this. So this was the first secret and the first moment when I realized as a child that I don't know everything about my parents, and that they actually may have a life that's not connected to me. I think it's a very psychological moment for a child when they realize that the world isn't all about them. It actually, you know, that people have their own lives and you don't know everything and you're not the center of the universe necessarily.
was that really your first inkling of maybe my life is not what I thought it was?
Yeah, I think growing up in Trinidad, I just felt like this completely free soul. And my parents did not have rituals in their lives. There was no religion. The rituals were around just daily life, you know, getting up and going to work and school. We didn't have family. We didn't have any of the things that a kind of normal family would have. So it was a very sheltered, quite isolated way of growing up, but also very open. So there was no restriction. So I just was who I wanted to be as a child. And as, you know, as things change and I grow up and as the politics of the place changes, that's when I become much more, again, aware of, I start becoming aware of who I am as a person with a cultural and racial background. But it's about whiteness at that point. It's not about religion or Jewish identity. It's about whiteness. This is the most shocking thing, is when I realized that I'm white. Like that was another amazing revelation for me, because as a child in Trinidad, I was looking out through these eyes at this incredibly diverse background of African descendant people, Indian, Chinese, like very few white people in Trinidad. So my view of the world was not the view that the world was maybe having of me. So I think going through all of the the tensions around the rise of the Black Power movement in Trinidad in the 70s was much more absorbing and confronting than anything else at that moment. And plus I didn't know. So it's when I come to Australia, and in Australia, everyone's white. And I feel like the world is completely topsy-turvy because I found all that whiteness very, very strange and quite uncomfortable. Again, I had to kind of sort of work out who I was. And then in the midst of this, it's by accident, we end up in a part of Sydney where there's a really strong Jewish community, an immigrant Jewish community. So I went to school with a group of kids who mainly came from the Middle East. So from Egypt and Turkey. There was like one kid who was from Israel. So I get thrown into a different world, and they're the ones who then go, Goldfish, that sounds like a really Jewish name. And I go home and ask my father. So this is the moment when he has to tell me the truth about that. But he dismisses it. You know, he says, we used to be. So he won't engage with it at all. But of course, it sets off that curiosity.
Big curiosity for you. I mean, this is your family's story. What you find your birth certificate, you start asking questions. Dad's not so really into sharing too much with you, but you sort of start to find your way to some of the answers. How did it go from you finding out about your family to a film?
Yeah, that's a big jump. I guess it's these things about the parallel lives that we have. So, you know, again, being an only child and growing up in Trinidad and not having family and not having those kind of usual family relationships, I had a very big imagination. And I also used to read a lot of books like the Enid Blyton Famous Five, or, you know, all these books where kids were often on adventures. So I think partly I just had this imagination around being a detective, and that, you know, if people were going to hide things, I was going to work out why, and I was going to uncover it. So this kind of childish curiosity that is quite intense, because it's a very emotional moment for me when I find out that I have a half brother and sister, for instance. This is a huge thing. You know, I'm an only child. I've got no family. And my father just kind of goes, oh yeah, you know, I had two kids, but I don't know where they are. So it's like, I have to find these children. I have to find my sister and brother. What an emotional storyline, you know, this 14-year-old going, I have to go and find, you know, my sister and brother, the lost sister and brother. So, but this is, you know, the teenage me kind of trying to connect. But it's part of, I guess, my development as a storyteller. So I'm starting to create stories in my head. I start writing things down. I have a diary where I write down about finding out about these things, about, you know, contacting the Canadian embassy and saying, you know, I've got this brother and sister somewhere in Canada. Can you help me find them? And them going, do you know what their name is? And I don't actually even know that their name isn't Goldfish at that point. So, but life goes on. And so I end up at university. I end up doing, you know, lots of different things. I start getting involved in performing arts, a little bit of film. I'm doing a bit of animation. I work in an animation company. So I'm kind of developing a creative life next to my own life. You know, they're, of course, totally integrated. So the film is so much later. You know, my parents have died. I can't upset them anymore. You know, I can actually start forensically looking at the clues that they've left behind in their possessions. So I come across stories that my father wrote that I hadn't read before. So all these things are putting together something that is like a little detective story, and it begins to feel like this could be, initially I thought this could be a stage show. You know, I would stand up there, I would tell this story, there would be pictures behind me that would show Trinidad and show all the little things that I find, and that I would build the story this way, and it would be a performance. So that was the first time I thought about it. But then I had the luck of working on a film project with an artist in Sydney called William Yang. And William Yang is a photographer, and he's a performer, and he was going around internationally telling stories of growing up in Australia as a Chinese gay man. And he's a photographer, and he had documented the whole gay and lesbian kind of life in Sydney, which is wild. You know, every year there's a huge Mardi Gras, and so it's a very big, dynamic gay and lesbian cultural life. So William was going around telling all these stories, but he was now in his 70s, and he was getting a little bit old to be standing up in front of audiences all over the world. So he got some money to turn his performances into films. And Martin, who, as I said, the editor I worked with, who's listening today, he worked with William. I set up a project for William to work in the university that I was working in. And then I got to be a co-producer on those films. So I had this incredible privilege of watching this very clever, experienced performer take these stories and turn them into films, and all the complications that come with trying to turn something where, you know, you're, instead of talking directly to people, even in this scenario where you can see someone's face and, you know, you're telling stories, to turn it into something that is visually works as a film. So over those 4 years with William, I learnt a lot. And meantime, I was going, this is obviously what's going to happen to my story. It's just perfect. I've got so many photographs. I've got home movies. I've got objects. I've just got all the things that visually could make a really interesting film. And people like the idea. And that's the thing. Once you have an idea and people become attached to it, you start building that creative team, because a film is a huge thing. It doesn't exist really. You have to be a very clever filmmaker to be able to do everything on a film. So that creative team, they have to really believe in the story you're trying to tell and bring all their knowledge and creativity to the project. It is a very collaborative process, which is why I think it ended up working. You know, it ended up being something that could go out into the world and have a life.
It's interesting that you bring up the, you know, taking notes and the detective work. And we interviewed an author with a similar kind of story. The book is called When Time Stopped. I believe that's the name of it. And she too had to be a detective and figure out, you know, what happened to her family, because her father also chose not to really share anything, but did leave clues for her, you know, after he was gone. So was your mom a little bit more agreeable to finding, you know, out about the family, or they were just both pretty much like, no?
No, they were very tight.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother's not Jewish. Excuse me. And I think she was very protective of my father. So if I ever tried to find anything out, she'd often say to me, in fact, that it was none of my business. It was like, in the film, I actually say that when I'm going, how can you hide the fact that I have a half brother and half sister from me? And it's my mother who says, it's none of your business. And I know that she's, you know, now I know she's protecting my father from what is a shocking emotional tragedy in his life of never seeing his children again. It's like, it's an extraordinary tragedy. And his silence around that, when I realize what he's, you know, years later as I mature, you realize what that meant for that person. You know, that's just a horrendous thing. So I think my mother was on his side. I used to try to find things out about her life too, because, you know, this young, very delicate white woman who kind of arrives in Trinidad, gets off a boat and doesn't get back on, is just as interesting a story in many ways, you know. But again, she would only give me little bits and pieces about her life and what she did during the war, and her life in Trinidad before she marries my father. So it was difficult. And I think it is a common experience, not, you know, particularly I think in the Jewish experience, this thing of wanting to get on with life and not being weighed down by these terrible things that have happened. This
We see it
resilience.
over and over again
Yeah.
in the films that we show, in the
Yeah.
books that we're talking about. The survivors themselves don't share very much information with their children.
Yeah.
But then the next generation, their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren, really want to know what happened, and for some reason they're a little bit more open to sharing with that next generation.
Yeah, and I think it's very typical of trauma. It's not necessarily the only way. Like some people with trauma, they will go over and over and over the trauma, but a lot of people will leave it behind as a way of surviving. And I think being in Australia now, and the kind of history in Australia of colonialism here, and basically, the English taking this country and not acknowledging the Indigenous people here. The way that Indigenous people in Australia talk about the trauma of being this people that was, they tried to make disappear, like really disappear, to the point that, Indigenous people only started voting in Australia in 1968, which was 4 years before I arrived in Australia. In Australia, when I arrived, it's still got the White Australia policy. It's like these really, this kind of denial of our humanity, this sort of categorizing of people, who's acceptable and who's not, who's going to survive and who isn't. And so a lot of the writing of young Indigenous authors I find really fascinating. There's a lot of connections there as well, of them trying to find out about culture, language, history, what has happened to their grandparents, their great-grandparents, where they come from, who they are, like who they belong to. So similar resonances.
And I think those kinds of things, unfortunately, are continuing around the world. So how has this, it was 10 years from kind of inception to the film, right?
So I actually think it might have been 14.
Okay.
Sorry.
14.
It's a really long time. Yeah. It's like the very first time that I started working on it was 2000, when I went to Trinidad with my half sister, and I took a little camera. And even then, I think what I was doing was trying to capture a sense of that place. And I didn't at that point know exactly why, but I think that's when it germinated. But with the film, really, it's all of that is like this research that happens, and then to make a film is such a big thing. It's really got to gather momentum very, very quickly. So the last 3 years is when it really comes together. The producers there, the editors there, the sound people, the script editor, and everyone's just like focused and to get this thing out. But it did take a long time.
So the 14 years of putting this all together, doing the research, really building a family. I mean, you really built,
as I go,
built a family. How has it changed you?
Yeah, people often ask that. It was such an amazing adventure making the film and actually discovering all the things I did along the way. But that, finding my half brother and half sister was really super important. And that happened in my 30s, that we really strongly connected. But making the film has brought me really close to my nephews and nieces, who are the children of my half brother who died very sadly, and that's in the film. And and finding the cousins, because that really brought together a broader family for all of us. And a lot of them, they live in America. A lot of my other family lives in Canada, and they're now in communication with each other. Like there was just little Facebook posts recently about visiting each other, and like none of that would have happened because those cousins that I found are my half sister's cousins. They're the cousins of my nephews and nieces. So I've actually broadened the whole family's family, and it gives. I really I really hate the fact I'm so far away from everyone, because physically I still can't connect with them, you know, in a way I'd really like to, because we all really liked each other. But it's fantastic to have that sense of belonging, of knowing that you're part of a bigger whole. Because, you know, again, in the film, I talk a lot about, you know, I have my own community, which comes from who I am as, you know, a queer person. I've got this wonderful, you know, community of friends in Sydney, my gorgeous partner, her family. All of that is fantastic, but it all kind of starts with me, and finding family in terms of history and making that connection back to our ancestors is this thing that's about an embedded sense of self, which goes really deeply and gives you a kind of strong sense of who you are. I think it's really important. I think that's why for a lot of, again, I keep going back to Indigenous people here, but I hear often in the young people when they talk, Indigenous people now introduce themselves not as Aboriginal, but they'll say, I'm Wiradjuri, I'm Bidjigal, they know the names of the tribes and the people that they come from. And these are very fractured, broken histories. And yet they've found these little through lines that take them back to the beginning. And I think that's the same with my film. I'm going back to some sense of this family, you know, with this incredibly long history in Europe, and an extraordinary history, hundreds of years of history, all gone, you know, in a flash. And it is a flash. It's like a generation. It's incredible.
It was really important when you wrote, I don't remember if it was the first letter or the second letter to your sister, but to share your lifestyle and you know, who you are. And obviously a huge part, I mean, kudos to you, because it was not, when you did it, wasn't as common as it is, you know, in 2020. Yeah. And so she was super open. I mean, I loved what she wrote in the letter about, hey, if you're happy, that's really all that matters, because love is not always easy to find. But what about the rest of your family? I mean, did your parents, how were your parents accepting? What about the broader family?
Yeah, I think part of the my experience of being accepted or not accepted does begin with my family, because my parents were not accepting at all, and they just were completely silent about my sexuality and my relationships, which I think is very sad, because it meant that, you know, I had a relationship with them and I felt loved by them, but they could not take all of me in. They couldn't accept who I was as a whole person. So when I was looking for family, I felt very strongly that I didn't want family that didn't accept me. So it was pretty important that I'd be upfront with people. It was always scary, because I think, you know, gay and lesbian people, a lot of us have had that experience of being rejected, even if it's a kind of silent rejection. That kind of silence is quite, is very hurtful. And even when I wrote to my sister, you know, she took a long time to write back. I think she was, I don't know, she just took a little bit too long. And I remember it was like 6 weeks and 8 weeks. And I thought, wow, she's not going to write back. I've really done it. And then that letter came and it was like, oh, thank God. And similarly with the cousins and everyone else that I came across, I was very open about my sexuality and also my politics, because, you know, I'm not this kind of, like, I'm quite a left-wing person. I'm a greenie. I'm, you know, someone that lots of people could argue with. But instead, you know, I just got acceptance. It's like my cousin Marilyn said really clearly, you know, everyone has lots of opinions in our family and all of them are welcome, you know, and we argue. And that's what's happened. So it felt real. It was very real. I think I had to be real. I couldn't be this kind of made up person that came along and fitted some little box. I had to just be who I was. But being accepted was really important. But I also knew that if I wasn't going to be accepted, that I would turn away, because yeah, that was more important than, you know, holding on to people if they weren't going to like you for who you were.
It was also incredibly brave, because here are people, you know, here are people that you don't know anything about. They don't really know anything about you, but you made it a point to let them know this is who I am, and
Yeah.
I'm going to be accepted as
Yeah.
I am. So I think it was incredibly brave. You know, JCC Chicago is one of the forerunners in inclusion in our agency, and it's really, it's an important thing that I think all my colleagues will agree, that it doesn't matter what you look like, who you like, what you're, you know, it doesn't matter. And you know, as the United States is kind of going through this racial uprising again, like doesn't matter what the outside looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. I really feel for America and the divisive politics that's happening there at the moment, because it's just fueling all of that. And similar things happen here. I was feeling actually really angry about politicians yesterday, because I was thinking how unethical they were. And not all of them, of course, but so many politicians are so busy making sure that they get re-elected that they actually don't care about the communities that they're representing. And that divisive politics has been very effective in getting people back in. And so the people who are the most divisive seem to be getting elected the most. You know, it's very, it's sad. And we know where that leads. Absolutely. So it's, yeah, I feel for you. I do. And with the COVID thing.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
It's been a mess here, but you know, we are survivors.
Yes.
Talking about how, you know, we know what happens. You went back to Germany to
Yes.
kind of, you know, walk the path, see where people lived. Why was it so incredibly important to you to get a German passport? Your father left. He didn't want to discuss it. He wanted nothing to do with what had happened. Why the German passport?
I think secretly, well, not secretly, I think it was kind of a little tiny bit of revenge in a way. I know it was controversial. I know that my father probably would have been outraged in some ways, but I just thought, no, I really want to put this back in the face of the German people by becoming, you know, one of them, by going, you know, this history of hundreds of years that I'm connected to, all of it matters. And getting that passport back was, that citizenship back, you know, because that's the thing, he lost his citizenship. It's not a choice. He, you know, it was stripped of him. He became a stateless person, even though he paid for a ticket to get on a boat and, you know, paid $10 or something to get off in Trinidad. He didn't have a passport. He was traveling on a Nansen passport. So he was a stateless person. And so one of the things I really wanted to do was collect citizenships. I wanted to be a Trinidadian citizen, an Australian citizen, a German citizen. I was kind of like thinking, oh, maybe I could expand, and, you know, every single possible citizenship I could have, you know, I would gather to myself. But then I ran out of energy. But the German citizenship was an important symbol of reclaiming history and, yeah, putting it in people's faces, so that when I would go through, you know, the passport controls, when I would go into Europe and I'd be in the line with the European citizens, particularly in Germany, you know, but I can't speak German. And they would go, how come you can't speak German? You've got this German passport. And I go, it's a long story.
Yeah. Did your dad ever speak German?
Not to me, but he was actually, when he was working in Australia, working as a salesman in the department store that he worked in, he was the translator. And there was a lot of German Jewish people who lived in this area in Sydney where we'd moved to. So my father would be the translator. I found that out later too. A friend of mine told me that he had this role in the department store. So he never forgot it. But yeah, he didn't speak it to me. I went to the Goethe Institute to try to learn German. It's a very hard language. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So, so where does religion fall into your life now? Because your mom wasn't Jewish, your dad wanted nothing to do with Judaism. So I see you have a menorah next to your koala bear
I
behind
know,
you.
I thought that was, I also have, I think, can you see, I think above that, oh yeah, there's a Buddha
Mm-hmm.
above that. Oh, and I think over in the corner here, there's a little Mary.
Yes.
So there's a few symbols here. The Mary is, my partner grew up in a Catholic family, so she's obsessed with Marys in her artwork, which she is another story. But I think, yeah, no, it's a really hard one, that one, because I feel so connected to Jewish people, and there's this part of me that just totally wishes that I could really connect in with, the kind of beyond the cultural and into the religious rituals, particularly with such a mixed family, because the majority of my family on my father's side are Jewish and are practicing, and they always include me. I feel very included that way as well. But I think religion has caused so much trouble in the world. There's no way I'm going to identify in that way as being part of one religion. I think I can't do it. I can't do it. I can identify culturally, but I think spirituality is something that doesn't have to be so categorized for me, But religion's fascinating. It's amazing, wonderful, wonderful thing when it's not dividing people.
So then where do you get your inner spirit, we call it Havana, I think is the Hebrew word for it.
Yeah.
Where does that come from? Or do you need it because you have all these other outlets?
I think feeling part of nature is a big thing for me. So that we're creatures just like other creatures. The kind of sense of connections that plant life and trees and the environment have with us, those things touch me very deeply, along with my connections with people, of course. And from that comes that energy. So, for instance, during this whole time of COVID, my partner and I left Sydney and we went to this little fishing village where I have a holiday house that I share with a friend. This tiny little place, 250 houses. And it's on this beautiful headland that has every kind of weather and beach and cliff and, happening all at once. And the last 5 months have just been extraordinary, and being able to be in all that weather on the sand, watching the ocean be different every day, like nothing ever stayed the same. It was so good for me to just be confronted by newness all the time. And then this growing sense of familiarity that comes with that, acceptance of how things can change and that we don't have to necessarily resist them. We just have to put on a raincoat or, maybe some warm socks that day, that you can go with things. So I think that's part of it, this sort of wonder around life, but also this experience of growing up in a family with such a complex history that is just, riven with political intrigue and, destruction and resilience and renewal, and just, it's completely energizing. This is people are, so amazing at the same time as being potentially so dreadful.
I find you to be just so calm and open, and you've gone through.
No.
Is that not true?
Of course not.
But that's the sense that I get. I mean, given the difficulties, not just with your parents kind of having these stories. I don't know if we ever all know everything we want to know about our parents. but figuring out who you are, and moving from a Trinidad where there was political upheaval, and now you're coming to a brand new place. I just find you so calm and relaxed, and I think that's a credit, whether it's to how your parents raised you, or you just found that in yourself because you needed to have some sense of calm and
I, I always,
normalcy.
I always find this very funny that because people do say this to me, and I just that sense that I might be appearing that way is in complete opposite to what I think is the turmoil that is constantly going on within. So it's very interesting. I don't know, but I think in fact that the anxiety that actually comes from that kind of crazy history and from being uprooted a lot, and around issues around acceptance and where you belong and where you're allowed to belong, all that complexity, I think made me very watchful. So I used to watch people a lot. I was always really reading what their kind of responses to me were. And I think part of that is why I became a performer for a while. I actually liked taking on accents and taking on different personas, because I was always watching people. But I guess in a way it's from really being a bit frightened about not fitting in. So you sort of watch and wait and make sure that you're safe. And there is an anxiety that sits in me that I think is completely connected to that history, and not history like the one that I've lived through, as well as the one that my father lived through. And it's again why I mentioned it in the film, that my brother was riddled with this anxiety to the point that he basically died of, he died from having a mental illness, basically from having been on drugs, so many drugs over his life. And my sister too is is quite anxious. I didn't want to talk about that in the film at all. It's not, I didn't want to talk about her particularly.
They've done studies of the children of survivors, and there's another book that I've read, and we've had the author come and talk to us when we could be in person live. And they've done studies that parents pass these things down sort of in DNA, and so people become frightened and anxious, and it's a scary thought. It's a scary thought.
And I think it's another learning exercise. Like, I'm 60 now, and I've had to learn through my life to be calm. I've had to constantly review my responses to things in life and make sure that they're real. And that has been part of my growing up, and it's part of my sensitivity to other people and to circumstances. And it's kind of why I do great in my job, because I'm really aware of how much people hide in terms of, how they're coping. So I'm always very careful with people. But definitely it's a part of it. And I found that I always felt with my two siblings that I was the lucky one. I was the furthest away from the trauma, and that Harry was the one closest. And so he suffered the most, and my sister had her issues and I have my issues, but they're getting less as you kind of, you went away from ground zero, which was, the traumatized parents who'd fled the racist, horrible, Germany to escape with their lives. It's like the further you got away from that, the better chance you had. Yeah.
So
it's interesting.
Yeah, it is really interesting. And I will send you the names of those books when
I actually wanted to ask you if anyone or you have read this book. I'm reading this at the moment.
No.
This is a really,
Martin
really
read
amazing
it.
book. A Paragon. And it's the story of the two men, the Palestinian man and the Israeli man, who both lost their daughters, whose daughters died. The Israeli man lost his daughter in a terrorist bomb in Israel in a restaurant. And the Palestinian man's daughter died from a rubber bullet shot by an Israeli soldier. And the two of them they tour internationally talking about their grief, but also about how to move forward and about peace. It's a really amazing book. So I don't know why. I had to sit it next to me while we were having this conversation. I was thinking, you know, a lot of what I wanted to do in the film was also to the complexity. Like, you know, my father comes from Europe as a Jewish man who's being terribly discriminated against, but he lands on an island where there's a history of slavery and indentured laboring. And as a white European, he's immediately put in a slightly more privileged position. And he's not as privileged as an English person because there's anti-Semitism, but he's more privileged than a black person. And then coming to Australia, we get rescued by the White Australia policy because the Australian person in the embassy in Trinidad, you know, asks my mother, is your husband black or white? And she says, why do you need to know that? And, you know, he says, well, if he's white, it will be easier. So being dogged by those kind of complex histories where you can take so many different positions, like there's so many different identities within that, so many experiences within that. So I'm always interested in like books like this where people who seem so opposite, you know, are driven to try to find a connection and to make a difference and change things. Not that we're very good at it, obviously, because
if we all keep trying a little tiny bit harder. But I did put the link to Colin McCann in the chat there, so if anyone is interested in that book.
That was quick.
I'm quick.
Very quick.
If there's one thing that you would want people who watch the film to take away, what would that be?
I think it is around that complexity of experience, and the idea of what is family and what makes us belong. And also just, I think the whole refugee experience of my father, that was another thing that was quite important, that to remind people to be kind, to take people in, to be generous, because it you know, you can change people's lives by letting them in the door rather than turning them around and sending them back into a ferocious ocean or back to a terrible place. So complex, that's me, everything, all those ideas. And I think people basically take from that film the thing that connects with them the most. I find that a lot from the sort of correspondence I have with people. Yeah.
I think what's really interesting is, you know, growing up, I had a pretty close family. We lived right next door to my mom's identical twin sister for more than, you know, half of my young life. And then, you know, everybody gets married and they move away and everybody gets involved in their own things. And we moved, you know, halfway across the country. So, you know, you kind of lose those connections. And so I think what I took away was, you can, even if you had them, you can still get them back. And so I think it's inspiring that, you know, you went and you really wanted to find out where you came from and who was connected to you. I think it's a wonderful gift that you gave yourself.
It's very true. It still is. Yeah. Yeah.
I like to ask these non-film specific questions, but which film has inspired you the most? Like, you know,
there's been many, but one that I really truly loved that I saw just a couple of years before I finished my film was Stories We Tell, which was a film by, what's her name? It's gone out of my brain. It's gone. But Stories We Tell was the story of a young woman. She's an actress and a filmmaker herself, and it was about her mother. And there was a secret about her mother and whether or not her father, the main protagonist's father, was actually her father. But the film is very cleverly put together from all the different stories that different members of the family tell about this kind of half secret, which is you know, is this woman's father really her father, and all the different opinions that people in the family have. And the film is stitched together so beautifully with recreated home movies and real home movies. And it's just this intriguing, beautiful creation of a story in itself. So it was, to me, that was magnificent storytelling.
Anita Lee is the director of that film.
Is
Anita
it?
Lee, yeah.
I thought it was Polly somebody.
Stories
Yeah.
We Tell, documentary.
Sarah Polley.
Oh yes, Sarah Polley. You
Sarah
are
Polley.
correct, sir.
That's it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Martin. That's my editor.
So
Martin's told many stories.
so
There are
is
other films too, but of course, they've all gone out of my head.
it's okay. That's okay. Are you thinking of making another film? What are you working on? What can we
Yeah.
look forward to? Maybe it's a book.
Well, I do often want to make a book that's still about this story, because I love my father's photographs. I love these little black and white photographs and all the things that are in them, and the people that I don't even know their names, but it's just the whole thing is just this capturing of this kind of lost life. It's just amazing, beautiful, these little, you know, images that he carried with him. It's like the only thing he took with him, you know, was that cutlery and this photo album. That was it. But really the next film I want to make is actually about the building industry. So it's completely different. So I'm working on that. It's around masculinity and the absence of women in the building industry, and what that actually does to men, in a way. That sort of, you know, construction of masculinity, because it's very negative in many, many ways. And the building industry has the highest suicide rate of any industry. It has the highest drug and alcohol abuse of any industry. And a lot of really lovely men also can't work in the building industry because of that kind of ferocious sort of masculinity that seems to come with it. So I'm kind of fascinated by that. Again, it's about that complexity and how you change things, because I kind of firmly believe if there were more men in the dance schools and more women in the workshops, that, again, the world would be a much better place. But that's about, yeah, it's about this construction of gender and the way that people kind of stopped from feeling like they can be whoever they want to be, you know, that men don't have to be just like this and women don't have to be just like this, that we can be who we really want to be. So, which is all part of, again, who I am now. You know, it's this not particularly wanting to have one particular constructed identity. So that's that film.
That's that. So is it different. Like in process? Like,
it started in the sense that I have a few people who want to work with me on it, and I have started applying a little bit for money, but I was so exhausted raising money to finish my first film. I'm kind of like, unless I get some money to actually develop the script, I don't think I'll be putting a huge amount of energy into it just yet. And it's also because everything is in complete chaos at the moment, and it's really hard to travel. It's really hard to see people. It's all the COVID restrictions make it really hard to go and do research and go and do interviews. And so I'm just kind of waiting for that to settle a bit. But I'm looking forward to doing that. Like I don't work in film consistently, but I do have this desire to tell stories. And I do like working with film and with images. So I have a feeling, you know, it will start to bubble. And it's waiting. I think often with these kinds of projects, it's you wait and then things happen. You meet the right person, you have that conversation, or you see something that makes the connection that means that you can move on a bit further. All of that stuff, it kind of unfolds in its own time. Documentaries on average take 11 years. Most people, they're very hard things to, if you're really doing a documentary where you're kind of letting the story tell itself, ultimately these things, yeah, they take a while.
unless you're Trevor and he does it in 3 years. So, because he did his
Yeah.
Monsieur Mayonnaise in like 3 years, he told
Yeah.
us. But then there
Yeah.
are other projects that take much longer. Well, you know that we have a question. Okay, it's from Martin, and he wants to.
He knows everything.
He wants to know how you envisioned the music working when you were writing the story. Is that? I think that's what he's asking.
Yeah, the music in the film was very important in terms of creating the rhythm, particularly I think for Martin as an editor, because my film is actually about 60, maybe 65% still images, which is unusual for a film. And we had to create a sense of movement, and the music and the sound being the additional effects that are brought in, separate to the composer's work, are the things that create that rhythm with the storytelling. And the composer who worked on the film, it's that similar thing of, you know, I saw this woman playing a cello probably 15 years ago. And a few years later, when I was starting to think about that film, I just was going, that woman playing the cello, she's going to be the one who's going to compose the music for this film. And when it got closer and I could contact her and go, would you be interested? She said, absolutely. And she wrote this, she wrote 10 or 11 pieces for the film, which we then recorded with, not an orchestra, but, you know, with a piano player, cellist, a couple of other musicians, like properly recorded. And, you know, basically this is the underscore of the rhythm of this film. Thank you, Martin. And the composer was Liberty Kerr, who's, just, again, it's the magic of the collaboration that happens in these projects when things are working. Because it doesn't always work. Oh my God, there are projects you just have to let go because nothing works. It's magic when they work.
It's just amazing. You know, I get an email with a link and a description to a film, and I'm like, okay, let's see, you know, and you don't really realize until you start talking to the people who are actually making the films what it takes and how long it takes and how many people are involved. And it's just, it's incredible.
It's incredible.
It really is incredible.
Like the sound designer I worked with, Julia Ackerholt, she's a small, very gentle person. And her response to the film was basically, she filled in all these little things that were so delicate and almost you wouldn't even know they were there. It was like, if there was a picture of a boat, there were seagulls, the sound of seagulls, the sound of the water, and very delicate. And again, these little additions turns what's a still image, a little bit of editing, a little bit of moving in on an image with that sound and the sound effects, and our imaginations are there moving. The water's moving, the boat's moving, and you're on it, that kind of thing. It's magic. People are so talented. Amazing. I was very lucky.
Amazing. Yeah. Sue, it's been an absolute delight to talk with you. I feel like you and I are kindred spirits. We could talk forever. I don't drink coffee, but I drink a lot of water. So we could get together on another Zoom. I don't know if I can manage that flight to Australia, much as I would love to come and visit.
I know. I really am feeling, I don't go overseas that often, but the thought of not traveling for, 2 or 3 years and not getting to see people is really hard. Because I always go to North America at least once every kind of 2 or 3 years. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, you're always welcome to visit us in Chicago, and we've got
this. Thank you so much for supporting my film. Was so great.
We'd love to see that. We'd love to premiere the next one when it comes out. Where we have the first woman CEO in 100, and now it's probably 111, 112 years of JCC Chicago. So she's all about strong women, and a large part of our staff is actually very very strong women. So we would love to share that film with the community when it's done. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day, because you're just getting started, and we're all getting ready to put on our pajamas and go to bed so we can start over tomorrow. Again, thank you so much. Everyone, thank you for joining us. Please visit our website, jccchicago.org. We've got filmmakers, we've got authors. We're visiting all the synagogues of Chicago tomorrow. So just check out what we've got going on. Everyone, take care, be well. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.